Most executives do not fail because they lack intelligence. They do not fail because they lack information. They fail for a much more uncomfortable reason, because they turn a probability into a certainty, and then they defend that certainty as if it were identity. And that error is extremely expensive. You do not lose money because you are wrong. You lose money because you are certain. That is the starting point of this analysis. And it is also the reason why superforecasting matters much more than it seems. Because this book is not about guessing the future. It is not about intuition. It is not about having some special sensitivity. And it is not about becoming one of those experts who sounds brilliant on television while being confidently wrong. It is about something else. It is about installing an operating system for decision-making, one that forces you to think in percentages instead of stories, in calibration instead of confidence, and in updating instead of ego. For years, we were sold a false image of what a good decision-maker looks like: the strong leader, the visionary founder, the expert who walks into a room and speaks as if the future were already settled. But the market does not reward that posture. It punishes it. The problem is that it punishes it later, and when it does, it is already too late. The bigger problem is that we confuse two different games. One is the media game. There, the winner is the person who sounds certain, the one who simplifies, the one who speaks in absolutes, the one who never doubts. The other is the real game. There, the winner is the one who survives contact with reality better than everyone else, the one who measures, the one who corrects, the one who does not need to defend an old opinion just because he already said it out loud. And that distinction is central, because many companies are being managed with the logic of spectacle. A lot of strategy is presented as inspiring narrative. A lot of investing is defended as if it were a moral statement. A lot of conviction is not conviction. It is attachment. That is why this book hits so hard, because it forces you to accept something almost nobody wants to accept. Thinking well does not mean always being right. Thinking well means spending less time being wrong. It means noticing sooner when your model no longer fits reality. It means stopping the habit of treating your opinions as an extension of your ego. And that, in business, in investing, and in strategy, is worth a lot. Let's begin with Playbook de Caja number 1, Destroy Certainty. The first shift this book demands is brutally simple. Stop speaking in absolutes and start thinking in probabilities. That sounds minor. It is not. Because an absolute statement cannot be audited. If someone says, "This is going to work," they have not actually said anything useful. We do not know how confident they are. We do not know what would make them change their mind. We do not know what data they used. And most importantly, later we will not know whether they were right because of process or because of luck. But when someone says, "I think this has a 65% chance of working," they have just opened the door to serious thinking. Now we can ask where that number came from. Now we can review whether they were overestimating the case. Now we can compare that probability with reality when the time comes. And here is one of the most powerful ideas in the book. The percentage is not decoration. The percentage forces process. That is why probabilistic thinking is not just an elegant trick for obsessive analysts. It is a survival discipline. Because the real world does not move in black and white. Almost no important decision comes with certainty. Almost everything lives in ranges. And anyone who insists on translating ranges into absolutes is simply disguising ignorance with a firm tone. Now, a lot of people respond to this with a quick objection. Fine, but there are situations where I cannot put a number on it. That is where another key tool from the first playbook comes in, the Fermi method. The logic is simple. When a question seems too complex to estimate directly, you break it into smaller parts. You do not try to guess the whole thing. You estimate the pieces. For example, if a company wants to evaluate whether it can open a new market, it should not begin by saying, "I think we can sell 20 million. That is not analysis. That is storytelling. What you do instead is break it down. How many people are there? How many of them can access the offer? How many would actually be interested? How much would they pay? Each part is still imperfect, yes. But now you are no longer throwing a number into the air. You are building an estimate you can defend. And that completely changes the quality of the conversation. Because now you are no longer arguing over loose intuitions. You are arguing over specific assumptions. You are no longer fighting over egos. You are fighting over variables. That is the difference between an organization that learns and one that improvises with sophisticated vocabulary. The closing idea of this first playbook is simple. If you cannot put a percentage on it, you probably have not thought hard enough. And if you cannot explain where that percentage came from, then you do not have a decision. You have a hunch disguised as strategy. Now, let's move to Playbook de Caja number 2. Use the outside view. This corrects one of the most expensive mistakes in business: falling in love with the internal narrative of your case while ignoring the outside view. Put simply, from the inside, every project looks special. Every company believes it has a unique advantage. Every founder thinks their story breaks the rule. Every team believes this time will be different. And sometimes that is true. The problem is that you almost never know that at the beginning. That is why the outside view is so powerful. Because it forces you to begin where the ego does not want to begin, with the base rate. Before you ask why your case will work, you have to ask what percentage of cases like yours worked before. Before you fall in love with the story, you look at the statistics. Before you explain why this time yes, you check how often this kind of bet ended badly. That does not kill ambition. It cleans it. A huge number of bad decisions do not come from a lack of analysis. They come from analyzing the inside too much and the comparable cases too little. The team knows every detail of its product, its culture, its vision, and its effort. But precisely because it knows all of that so well, it stops seeing the colder context. And the colder context is usually where truth lives. Think about companies that felt invincible because their internal metrics looked flawless, while the environment around them had already changed direction. Strong margins, happy customers, efficiency, a strong culture. But if the base rate of your industry is already moving in another direction, none of that is enough. That is the kind of error that kills incumbents, because from the inside, everything still makes sense, but from the outside, it no longer does. And here a vital distinction appears. The internal narrative will always sound richer, more emotional, and more persuasive than the outside view. The base rate is dry, cold, uncomfortable. It flatters no one. It does not celebrate your originality. It does not respect your effort. It only reminds you of one very hard truth. Most cases are not exceptions. They are repetitions. That is why the outside view is an antidote to executive arrogance. It does not mean you have to obey historical statistics blindly. It means you cannot afford to ignore them. It means that before approving an investment, an expansion, or a new product line, you should write down two things. First, what the base rate is. Second, why you believe your case has the right to escape it. And that second part has to be much more demanding than it usually is, because almost every team has a story about why their case is different. The real filter is not whether they have a story. The real filter is whether that story is strong enough to defeat the statistics. Most of the time it is not. That is the point almost nobody wants to hear. Your company is not special just because it feels special to you. Your thesis is not stronger just because you told it well. Your conviction is not worth more than the base rate. And until the data proves otherwise, your case has to carry the weight of the average. That sounds harsh, but it is infinitely cheaper than discovering it after you have already burned capital, time, and reputation. Now let's go to Playbook de Caja number 3. Update without ego. This is probably the hardest part of the whole system, because one thing is to accept intellectually that you may be wrong. And something very different is to accept operationally that your thesis no longer works and now has to be adjusted, reduced, or killed. That is where most people fail, not because they cannot see the evidence, but because the evidence threatens something deeper. It threatens the image they have of themselves. If your decision has already become identity, changing it feels like humiliation. If your thesis has already become status, correcting it feels like losing position. If your bet has already become part of your personal story, letting go feels like admitting weakness. And that is why so many people fail to update in time. They defend old decisions for reasons that have nothing to do with reality. They do it for consistency, for pride, for fear of looking bad, for fear of seeming indecisive, for fear of breaking the story they already told their team, their board, or the market. But reality does not reward that. Reality does not give you points for emotional coherence. Reality charges you for continuing to support an expired thesis. This is where superforecasting becomes especially useful, because it insists on treating beliefs as temporary hypotheses, not possessions. You take them, you use them, you review them, you correct them, and if necessary, you abandon them. That requires living in perpetual beta, in other words, operating in continuous update mode. Not like someone with no judgment, but like someone who understands that real judgment does not mean clinging. It means recalibrating. But there is a second layer that is even harder. It is not enough to react when new evidence appears. You also have to actively search for the evidence that contradicts your thesis. You need to build your own dragonfly eye. That means multiple perspectives, not a single lens. That means institutionalizing useful disagreement, not opening endless debates, not celebrating chaos, but forcing the system to produce intelligent friction. Assign someone to destroy the thesis. Look for the strongest rival argument. Study the competitor's data. Simulate what someone with no emotional attachment to your decision would do. That exercise is critical because many decisions would continue to exist only as long as nobody dares to ask seriously whether they still make sense. And a mature organization should be able to ask that question without drama. In fact, one of the best tests of executive rationality is this. If a new CEO walked in today with no attachment to past decisions, would that person keep this bet exactly as it is? If the answer is no, but you are still holding it, then you are probably not defending a strategy. You are defending your story. That is why a good decision culture does not reward the person who never changes their mind. It rewards the person who changes with judgment, on time, and for the right reasons. In strategy, consistency is not always a virtue. Very often, it is a trap. If you put these three pieces together, what appears is something very different from a typical psychology or business book. This is not a manual for sounding smarter. It is a system for being wrong better and faster than the average. First, you destroy certainty. You stop speaking as if you can see the future and start assigning probabilities to scenarios. Second, you use the outside view. You stop looking only at your case from the inside and compare it with the real history of similar cases. Third, you update without ego. You treat your decisions as revisable hypotheses, not as extensions of your identity. That system may look less heroic than the classic image of the great decision maker, but it works better. And here it is worth marking an important distinction. This book does not stop at saying that the brain has biases. It does not stop at saying that the world is uncertain and leave it there. What it does is more operational. It gives you a concrete way to decide better despite those biases and inside that uncertainty. That is the real value for an operator, not walking away more humble. That is too abstract. Walking away with a ritual, with a structure, with a practice you can install. And that ritual could be as simple as this. In your next major strategy meeting, ban 4 words: certain, impossible, guaranteed, and obvious. In their place, require 3 things for every relevant decision. First, an explicit percentage, not a feeling, a number. Second, a base rate. What percentage of comparable cases actually worked? Third, a review date and a kill criterion. When are we going to review this thesis? And what would have to happen for us to admit it no longer works? Nothing else. But if you do only that, you have already changed the level of the conversation. Because now you are no longer discussing who sounds more convincing. You are discussing quality of judgment. And that is exactly what separates teams that learn from teams that only react. The teams that learn turn every decision into future information. The teams that only react turn every mistake into a fight over narrative. In the end, the market does not reward the person who sounds most certain. It rewards the one who calibrates best against reality, and it charges the difference to everyone else. That is why Superforecasting should not be read as a book about prediction. It should be read as a book about decision discipline, because almost nobody needs to become an oracle. But every serious operator needs to stop treating certainty as an asset. Certainty is not a strength. Very often, it is the hidden cost destroying the quality of your decisions. And the sooner you understand that, the cheaper it will be. See you in the next Playbook de Caja.